Funny, when I think back, meeting Nicole feels like another lifetime. She was like a shot of adrenaline into my life, someone who just fit from the start. It was summer, hot as hell, and we'd all gathered at this volleyball tournament by the lake. I was there with a few friends from work, and Nicole was there with her friends, looking like she was born to be outside, laughing her head off, carefree. I remember watching her spike the ball, this determined look on her face, and thinking, damn, I had to meet her. We got introduced after one of the games, all sweaty and sunburned. She joked about how I didn't look much like a volleyball player. I laughed, probably too loud, and threw something back at her, like, neither do you. She was all grit and energy, pulling me into the conversation without a second thought. By the end of the day, we'd swapped numbers, and I was already planning when I'd see her next. One thing led to another, and soon we were spending almost every day together. Late nights turned into early mornings, talking about everything and nothing, grabbing last-minute flights for weekend getaways, trying out every taco place within a 100-mile radius. She'd light up over little things, and that laugh of hers, it could fill a room. It wasn't long before I was sure I'd found my person. A year later I proposed, and she said yes without missing a beat. The early years were good. Solid. We had each other's backs, no matter what. I was working as a software developer, long hours sometimes, but I loved the work, and Nicole supported that. She was just as driven, working her way up in her company. We made a solid team, investing in a couple of properties, building up our savings, sketching out all the usual plans. Kids someday, a few more investments, traveling while we were still young. That's what made us click, I think. We both had this drive to build something real together. But things started to change slowly, and I didn't see it coming. Nicole had started climbing up the corporate ladder even faster. The late-night work calls, the weekend business meetings, the work trips out of state, it all became normal. She'd come home tired, stressed out, but then there was this distance. I don't know how else to put it. Little by little, it felt like she was in the room, but her mind was miles away. She used to come home from work, throw her stuff down, and tell me every little thing that happened that day. Now she'd just say, it was fine, and disappear into her phone. Then came Edward. I didn't think much of it at first. She mentioned him a couple of times, said he was a new guy in the office working on her team. I'm not the jealous type, so I didn't ask too many questions. But slowly, his name started popping up more often. Edward said this, or Edward had this idea. They'd have these work dinners that didn't end till 11. I'd wake up sometimes, and she still wouldn't be home. One night, I made her favorite dinner, pasta, garlic bread, the whole thing. I'd put in effort, maybe because I was already feeling that distance between us. She called around 8 to say she was heading to Edward's place. To finish a project, she said, like it was nothing. I didn't even know she went to colleagues' apartments after hours. I told myself not to overthink it. She was just working hard, right? The excuses started piling up. She canceled date nights we'd planned for weeks, missed our friend's birthday, and even skipped out on family dinners she used to love. Anytime I brought it up, she'd brush it off, say she was busy and stressed, and that I was overreacting. She started talking down about things between us, acting like our whole relationship was somehow beneath her now. I'd bring up memories, our wedding, the trips we took, the house we saved up for, and she'd just roll her eyes. It was like she'd already made up her mind and just hadn't told me yet. Then one day, during one of these chats where she talked in circles, she finally dropped the bomb. She looked at me with this cold, flat expression and said, "I don't think I ever really loved you, Kurt." I sat there in shock, just staring at her, trying to process what she'd just thrown at me. "You never loved me?" I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. It came out low, like I was afraid speaking too loud would make the whole situation explode. She sighed, like she was annoyed by the question. "We were young, Kurt. I think I got swept up in it all. You were stable, you were good to me. And I thought, maybe that was enough." She leaned back, crossing her arms, not an ounce of emotion on her face. "But it just wasn't, okay? I need something more." The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. This was the woman I'd spent years with, my partner in everything. We'd worked so hard to build something real, and now she was just letting go of it? I asked her, "When did this start? When did you start feeling like this?" She rolled her eyes, brushing me off like I was being overly dramatic. "It's not like there was some exact moment, Kurt. I just realized over time that I needed something different. I don't want to feel trapped in something that's not right for me. And with Edward, I think I just have a better idea of what I want. Edward. Hearing his name from her own mouth, like he was some kind of knight in shining armor who swooped in and opened her eyes, made me feel like the floor had been yanked out from under me. This guy had slipped into our lives as just a colleague, and now he was somehow her idea of real love? I tried to keep my voice steady, tried to understand where this was all coming from, but my mind kept spinning back to that one thing she'd said: she never really loved me. She looked at me, like she was waiting for some big dramatic reaction, maybe even a fight. I think part of her wanted me to scream or accuse her, to let her pin me as the bad guy. But I didn't give her that satisfaction. I just sat there, quiet, nodding like a fool, trying to process how the life I thought we had was apparently nothing to her. "Fine," I finally said, swallowing down the bitterness. "You want a divorce? Then we'll go through with it. I'm not going to keep trying to hold on to someone who doesn't even want to be here." She nodded, almost relieved, like she'd won. Like she'd gotten what she came for. She mumbled something about finding herself, about how she hoped we could be civil through it all, but I barely heard it. All I could hear was the word divorce, echoing in my head. That night, after she went to bed in the guest room, I just sat there, staring into the dark, trying to piece together how everything had crumbled so fast. The days after that were a blur. Nicole seemed almost eager, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She moved around the house with this new energy, making calls, packing up little things here and there, setting up meetings with Edward. She didn't even try to hide it. There was no shame, no hesitation, just Nicole, pushing forward like she was finally getting what she wanted. I did my best to keep my head on straight. Started working with a lawyer, going over the finances we'd built together. Property, investments, all the stuff we'd put years into. Now I had to figure out how to split it all up like some cold business deal. I could tell she assumed she'd walk away with most of it, like she deserved to for finding herself. But I wasn't about to let her walk all over me like that. Friends started noticing something was off. We used to be the couple everyone thought was perfect. Friends would joke about how they'd kill for a marriage like ours, how we were goals. And now? They were seeing cracks. Nicole stopped showing up at gatherings, avoided group chats, and I started hearing whispers, friends asking what was going on. I kept things vague at first, not ready to share the mess that was unfolding behind closed doors. But Nicole didn't care. She started dropping hints to friends, framing it like she'd outgrown me, like I was holding her back from being herself. Eventually, I got tired of sitting in silence while she painted herself as the innocent one. So one night, when a few close friends came over, I laid it out. I told them how she'd been spending all her time with Edward, how she wanted out because she'd never loved me and now wanted to chase some new life with him. I didn't sugarcoat it, didn't dress it up. Just the truth. And they were stunned. They'd watched us grow together, build a life together. They'd seen all the things we'd done to get here. To hear that she was throwing it away for some guy from work left them just as blindsided as I'd been. After that night, word spread quickly. I didn't have to do much explaining. Friends were talking, and everyone started putting the pieces together. Nicole must have heard about it because she texted me the next day, saying we needed to keep things private and that I was making her look bad. I couldn't believe the nerve. I texted back, plain and simple, "You did this, Nicole. If you're embarrassed, maybe you should have thought of that before." After that, she stopped trying to control the narrative, at least with me. But it didn't stop her from pushing my buttons in other ways. She started treating the house like it was already hers, making plans for what she'd do with her space once I was gone. Her things started creeping out of the guest room and into shared areas, like she was marking her territory. Every day felt like she was just erasing more of what we'd built. Then, out of nowhere, she told me she wanted to sell our investment properties. "It's just cleaner that way," she said, "especially with the split." But I knew she wasn't thinking about a clean break. She wanted quick cash, probably to start her new life with Edward. That's when I realized I had to play it smart. I didn't argue, didn't push back too hard. I just nodded and said I'd think about it. Behind the scenes, I started meeting with my lawyer, getting all the advice I could. We went through every asset, every account, and he told me to be patient, to hold my cards close. Nicole was getting bolder too. She'd invite Edward over, said it was to pick up some things from work. Right there in our driveway, acting like she didn't have a care in the world. I'd watch from the window as they'd laugh, completely at ease. I could feel my blood boiling, but I kept quiet. I knew I had to stay calm and see this thing through. But it was like every move she made just chipped away at what little respect I had left for her. The woman I'd married, who I'd once trusted with everything, was now a stranger to me, a stranger who wanted to take everything we'd built and leave me with nothing. I'd be lying if I said it didn't hurt. But that hurt was slowly turning into something else: determination. If she thought she was just going to walk away with my life, she had another thing coming. I started moving forward quietly, keeping my plans close. I knew Nicole was banking on me to just roll over, let her take the lion's share so she could sail off with Edward, but I wasn't about to make it that easy. I worked with my lawyer to map out every asset, every detail of our finances. He pointed out things I hadn't thought of: long-term investments, retirement accounts, things we'd saved over the years that Nicole probably didn't even realize were on the table. "You're entitled to half of everything," he reminded me, which was exactly what I planned to claim. Meanwhile, Nicole acted like she had me beat. She'd come home talking on the phone to Edward, sometimes right in front of me, like I was just some guest she had to tolerate in her house. She was already talking about moving in with him after the divorce was final, saying how free she'd finally feel. I started wondering if she was doing it on purpose, just to get under my skin. Maybe she wanted me to break down, give her a reason to paint me as the bad guy. So, I kept my head down and played the long game. We'd have these tense conversations over dinner, splitting bills, talking logistics, all while she dropped hints about starting fresh and how the divorce was a new beginning. It made me sick, but I kept a steady tone, nodding along and giving her as little as possible. And every time she'd smirk or give me that cold look, it only made me more focused on my plan. About a week later, I let friends and family know what was happening. My parents were in shock. Nicole had been part of our family for years. They knew her as the bright, ambitious woman who'd brought joy into my life. Hearing that she was throwing it away for some guy from work, they couldn't wrap their heads around it. Her parents were equally stunned. I could tell they didn't know how to respond. Her dad called me later that night, telling me he didn't agree with her decisions but that they were trying to be supportive. I could hear the disappointment in his voice. He kept saying, "I don't know what happened to her, Kurt. She used to be so grounded. It was like she'd fooled everyone, my family, her family, our friends." But now, as the truth came out, I started seeing who was on my side, who believed in me. And as painful as it was, it gave me a strange kind of strength. The more I talked to people, the more I realized I wasn't alone in this. It felt like a fight I could actually win. With things out in the open, I felt more anchored. Friends checked in regularly, and family offered support I hadn't expected. My mom even called Nicole's parents to clear the air and understand why this was happening. Apparently, they didn't have any answers. Nicole had fed them some story about how we'd grown apart, how she needed more, and how Edward was just a friend. They were as blindsided as anyone. Nicole, on the other hand, kept pushing forward, like nothing could shake her. She came home one day with new furniture ideas, saying she planned to redo the place once I was out. It was surreal, listening to her talk about my own home as if I were already a memory, something she could just clean out and replace with newer, shinier things. When she mentioned selling the house, I played it cool. "I don't know, Nicole," I said. "Maybe we should take a step back and look at the long-term benefits of keeping it as an asset." I could tell she didn't like that answer. She wanted quick cash, not long-term anything. She kept pressing, but I didn't budge. I knew she was getting frustrated, but the more frustrated she got, the calmer I felt. One day, Nicole threw me a curveball. She mentioned that she and Edward were thinking about moving to a new city after the divorce. "I just need to get away from here, from all the judgment, the whispers," she said, as if she were the victim in all of this. "It'll be good for both of us," she added, emphasizing both like it was some new chapter she couldn't wait to start. Hearing her talk like that, it was a mix of anger and relief. On one hand, I couldn't believe she'd wipe our life clean and jump right into a new one without a second thought. But on the other hand, it confirmed that she was done, that there was no going back. And honestly, that made it easier to dig my heels in. So, I leaned into my own life. I reached out to a few friends, picked up an old hobby of mine, guitar, that I hadn't touched in years. I spent weekends outside, jogging, clearing my head. I was determined to make sure that once this was over, I'd have something solid, a version of myself that didn't rely on her. The funny thing? The more I focused on myself, the more Nicole seemed to notice. She started making comments about how detached I seemed, even asked if I was dating someone else. Just taking care of myself, Nicole, I told her. The truth was, she had no idea who she was dealing with anymore. I could see her trying to read me, to figure out why her usual digs weren't hitting as hard. She was losing control of the narrative, and it showed. The power shift was subtle, but it was there. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was scrambling to hold on. I was ready to let go and fight for what I'd built. And she could sense it. The tension kept building. Nicole started acting like the divorce was a done deal, but every time she tried to corner me into a quick decision on the house or our savings, I'd keep my cool and tell her we'd let the lawyers handle it. It was driving her nuts. I could see her growing impatience every time I brought up the need for a fair split, mentioning things like retirement savings and investment accounts. Her whole plan was unraveling, and she hated it. Meanwhile, I kept steady. I'd even started going to the gym, sticking to a routine, and meeting up with friends for coffee or a drink, trying to build a life that didn't revolve around her. My lawyer suggested I focus on things that kept me grounded and busy, so I took that advice seriously. It felt good, surprisingly good, actually. I wasn't just waiting for her next move, I was living my own life. Nicole must have sensed the change because, out of nowhere, she tried a new approach. One night, she made dinner, one of my favorite dishes from when we first got together, chicken piccata with roasted potatoes. She even set the table with candles, a small vase of flowers, and some of that soft jazz she used to play back when things were good between us. I walked in, stunned. It was like stepping into a time capsule, like she was trying to rewind the past. She was all smiles, talking about how things had gotten out of hand, and how she didn't want the divorce to be ugly. She kept saying how she wanted us both to end up happy. It was so smooth that, for a second, I almost bought it. But then she started talking about moving on, about how selling the house quickly would help us both get a fresh start. And that's when it hit me, this whole dinner was just a setup. So, I played along. I smiled, nodded, and agreed that we both deserved happiness. I let her talk about all her plans for the future, pretending to take it in, but deep down, I knew it was all about pushing me into a corner. The house sale, the bank accounts, she was trying to get me to give up my ground by playing nice. I couldn't believe I almost fell for it. After dinner, as we were clearing the table, she put a hand on my arm, like we were suddenly close again. "Kurt," she said, all soft and sympathetic, "don't you want a chance to start fresh too?" I looked her right in the eye and said, "Yeah, I do. And that's why I'm making sure everything's fair, so we both get exactly what we're entitled to." Her face dropped. She didn't have a comeback for that one. She'd tried everything, coldness, anger, and now this fake warmth, but I wasn't budging. She didn't know how to respond, so she just muttered something about needing space and retreated to the guest room. That night, I felt stronger than I had in months. She'd tried to play her last card, and it didn't work. And now? Now it was all about finishing this thing on my terms. The fake niceness didn't last long. A few days after that dinner, Nicole went back to her usual tactics. She'd throw snide comments my way, acting like I was the one dragging this out. "It doesn't have to be this difficult, Kurt," she'd say, crossing her arms and giving me this condescending look. But the more she tried to rush things, the more I felt like I was holding steady, and it was starting to get under her skin. Then she upped the ante. She started moving things out of the house without telling me. I'd come home to find a whole shelf of books gone, or some of the artwork we'd bought together missing from the walls. I knew what she was doing, trying to make the place feel less like home, like she'd already moved on and was leaving me behind in the process. But instead of reacting, I just cataloged everything she took and made sure it was noted for our asset list. Every time she tried to pull a fast one, I'd just quietly prepare. One day, I caught her packing up a few boxes in the living room, taking things that were clearly ours, not hers. She looked up, surprised to see me there, and for a second she froze. Then she gave this half-hearted shrug and said, "I figured you wouldn't mind if I got a head start on a few things. It's not like you were attached to any of this, right?" I kept my voice calm. "Actually, I think we should go over everything together. You know, just to make sure things stay fair." She glared, clearly annoyed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she just muttered something under her breath and went back to her packing, a little more subdued this time. I could tell she didn't expect me to be this level-headed, didn't expect me to stand up for myself so calmly. And that was power. The next day, I sat down with my lawyer and went over everything she'd been taking. He nodded, impressed, and told me I was doing the right thing by keeping track of every little detail. This could play out in your favor, he said, reminding me that any attempt she made to take assets unilaterally would reflect poorly on her in court. It was the fuel I needed to keep going, to stay patient while she scrambled to maintain control. And then, as if she could sense things weren't going her way, Nicole tried a new approach again. She texted me one night, saying she wanted to talk. I knew this wasn't going to be another dinner, so I braced myself, expecting another manipulative speech. But instead, when she sat down across from me that night, she looked genuinely rattled. She was fidgeting, picking at her nails, which was rare for her. Finally, she just blurted it out. "Kurt, I need you to speed things up. I need this over with." I raised an eyebrow, leaning back. "What's the rush, Nicole?" She hesitated, avoiding eye contact. "Edward and we have plans, okay? It's just time for me to move on." The whole thing felt surreal, like she was trying to rush through the fallout of our entire life so she could play house with someone else. I could feel the anger simmering under the surface, but I kept my cool. "We'll finish this fairly," I said slowly. "But we're doing it right, no shortcuts." She looked frustrated, almost desperate, but she didn't push back. She just nodded, lips pressed tight, and walked out of the room. For the first time, it felt like she was the one waiting on me. As the days went on, Nicole's patience was wearing thin. She'd drop little comments like, "You're dragging your feet," or "Maybe you're just trying to make this harder than it needs to be." I'd just smile and tell her I wanted to be thorough. Every time she realized I wasn't backing down, I could see her irritation grow. Then one morning, I was getting ready to head out for a meeting with my lawyer, and I noticed her sitting at the kitchen table, phone in hand, looking a little too focused. She was scrolling through apartments on her phone, mumbling about square footage and good school districts. It was like she'd already mentally checked out of our life and was fully investing in this new one with Edward. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at the irony. Nicole, who'd never wanted kids with me, was suddenly so interested in family-friendly neighborhoods. I didn't say a word, just watched her obsess over her new perfect life. But inside, I was getting more resolved by the day. The next time I met with my lawyer, I went over everything we documented so far, every item she tried to take, every bank account she'd mentioned. My lawyer leaned back, nodding. "Kurt, I think we're ready to put an offer on the table," he said, pushing a stack of papers my way. The offer was fair, more than fair, honestly. But I could see the balance tipping toward me, especially with all her recent stunts. "Present it to her," I told him. "Let's see what she thinks of it." Later that night, Nicole got the papers. She walked into the living room, papers clenched in her hand, her face set in this annoyed expression. "So this is your idea of fair, huh?" she said, voice dripping with sarcasm. I looked up from my laptop, calm as ever. "Yeah, I think it's more than fair. I'm leaving you with half of everything, plus the investment properties. What's wrong with that?" She didn't answer right away. I could tell she'd expected to get more, probably assumed I'd roll over, sign everything away, and let her take off without a second glance. But now, faced with an actual fair split, she was frustrated. Maybe even a little panicked. After a long pause, she shook her head and muttered, "Fine. I'll look it over with my lawyer." Then she stormed out, slamming the door to the guest room behind her. In that moment, I realized she was finally understanding that I wasn't the pushover she'd counted on me to be. She could take her time, weigh her options, but I was going to protect what I'd built, what we had built. This wasn't just her show to run anymore. And for the first time in months, I felt a sense of calm settle over me, like I'd finally taken back control of my own life. Nicole went quiet after that. No more digs, no more attempts to play nice or push me around. It was almost unsettling, like she was regrouping, planning her next move. But I kept my head down, sticking to the plan, meeting with my lawyer, and managing my work. Life was becoming a strange new normal, where the person I'd once shared everything with had turned into a stranger I barely even recognized. Then, a couple of weeks later, things took an unexpected turn. I was working late in my home office when I heard the front door slam. Nicole came storming in, her face red with anger. She didn't even say anything at first, just stood there, breathing heavily like she was trying to hold it all together. Finally, she blurted out, "Edward and we're done." I raised an eyebrow, doing my best to look neutral, though inside, I felt a strange mix of relief and grim satisfaction. "Sorry to hear that," I said, keeping my voice as even as I could. She looked at me like she was waiting for something, maybe sympathy, maybe comfort. But I just sat there, letting the silence stretch. Eventually, she started talking, almost rambling. She told me that Edward had second thoughts about moving forward, that he wasn't ready to commit. Apparently, he backed out of their plans to move in together, saying he needed time to think, leaving her in the lurch. So now what? I asked, watching her carefully. Nicole hesitated, her confidence visibly shaken. I don't know, she admitted quietly. I didn't think it would end like this. I could see it all over her face, the regret, the uncertainty, the realization that maybe she'd made a mistake. But as much as part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, I couldn't ignore everything she'd done, how she'd walked out on me, how she'd treated me like I was nothing. After a long pause, I leaned back in my chair and looked her straight in the eye. Well, Nicole, maybe it's time for you to start over. You wanted a fresh start, right? She didn't answer, just stared at me, looking more lost than I'd ever seen her. I could tell she hadn't expected me to be so calm, to have moved on, even if only partially. Without another word, she turned and walked out of my office, heading upstairs to the guest room. I could hear the door close, soft this time, like the last bit of fight had drained out of her. And as I sat there, I realized something. I didn't feel the anger or resentment I thought I would. There was just a quiet kind of closure. Nicole had made her choices, and now she'd have to live with them. For me, it was time to keep moving forward, leaving the past exactly where it belonged. Nicole stayed quiet after that night. No more snide comments, no more late-night calls with Edward. It was like she was finally realizing just how much she'd thrown away. She started spending more time at the house, barely going out, keeping to herself in the guest room. Sometimes, I'd see her just sitting at the kitchen table, staring into her coffee like she was trying to figure out how she'd ended up here. But honestly, I didn't spend too much time worrying about it. I was focused on moving forward, on rebuilding my life piece by piece. One afternoon, my lawyer called with the final divorce paperwork. Everything was settled, assets divided, investments split, the house left to me. It felt like a huge weight was lifted. I was finally free from this mess. All I had to do now was get Nicole's signature, and it'd be done. That evening, I found her in the living room, looking through an old photo album. She barely looked up as I placed the papers in front of her. "This is it," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Once you sign, we're done." She stared at the papers for a long time, then looked up at me, her expression almost unreadable. "I never thought it would end like this, Kurt," she said softly. I didn't answer. What was there to say? She'd made her choices, and they'd led her here. But there was a part of me, a small part, that felt the weight of those memories she was flipping through, the life we'd built, the dreams we'd shared before it all fell apart. She had to be feeling it too, that loss. After a moment, she picked up a pen and signed. Just like that, it was done. She handed the papers back to me, and there was this strange, quiet finality between us. No big fight, no last-minute apology, just a shared understanding that we were both moving on, even if it wasn't the way either of us had imagined. As she handed over the papers, I could see she wanted to say something more. But instead, she just stood up and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there with the signed documents in hand. I watched her go, realizing it was likely the last time we'd ever share this space as anything close to a couple. And as I looked around the house, I felt a strange sense of peace. It was over, for real this time. Whatever future lay ahead was finally mine alone to shape, without the shadow of her betrayal hanging over me. Nicole moved out that weekend. She packed her things quietly, no dramatics, no drawn-out goodbyes. I could feel her tension, though. Every now and then, I'd catch her looking around like she was taking in every corner of the place she'd once called home. She didn't say much to me, and honestly, I was okay with that. I just watched as she loaded boxes into her car, the last remnants of her life here, and tried to hold on to the feeling of closure I'd fought so hard to reach. The last box was sitting by the door, one I hadn't seen her pack. She picked it up and paused, looking at me. "I know I hurt you, Kurt," she said, her voice soft. "I didn't mean for things to turn out like this." There was a sadness in her voice, maybe even a touch of regret, but it didn't hit me the way I thought it would. I nodded, not looking away. "It's done, Nicole. We've both got to live with it now." She nodded too, then walked out the door without another word. I stood there, watching her leave, waiting for something: anger, sadness, relief. But all I felt was a calm acceptance, a quiet understanding that I was free. Free from her, from the lies, from the weight of trying to hold together something that had been gone long before she'd admitted it. After she left, the house was silent. For the first time in months, I walked through every room, knowing it was finally mine again. I let myself remember the good times, the memories we'd built in these rooms. But I also let myself feel the betrayal, the anger, everything I'd held back while fighting through this. I had a right to feel it all, and as strange as it sounds, letting myself do that felt like the last step to closing this chapter. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the weight of the past few months finally lifting. I put on some music, poured a drink, and just sat there, staring out the window at the empty driveway. There was no one coming home late, no one pulling in from some business trip. Just me, and the stillness of a life I was about to rebuild. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe again. Over the next few weeks, life started taking on a new shape. I threw myself into my work, taking on more projects and keeping late nights in my home office. But this time, it wasn't out of avoidance. It was because I finally felt focused, even excited, about what was ahead. It was a relief not to have that constant tension in the house, the feeling of waiting for another fight, another betrayal. I could actually just exist. Friends were a constant support during this time. A few of them came over to help clear out the last remnants of Nicole's things, cracking jokes, pulling out ridiculous mementos, and reminiscing about better times. One night, we even found an old box in the basement filled with some of the good wine she and I had been saving for special occasions. We popped open a bottle right there, sitting in the middle of the mess and toasting to new beginnings. They saw me through the worst, and now they were here to help me rebuild, something I didn't take lightly. It felt good to reclaim the house, and I realized how much of it I'd let Nicole shape over the years. Her choice of decor, her pictures on the walls, her style everywhere. Now it was like every piece I changed, every wall I painted, brought me back to life in small ways. I replaced the curtains she'd picked, bought new furniture, added color to the rooms that felt too sterile, too impersonal. It was small stuff, but it made the place feel like mine, not a relic of what we'd lost. One night, I tackled the attic, which had been long overdue for a good clean-out. Among the dust and boxes of random stuff we'd barely touched, I found a box marked photos. Inside, there were hundreds of memories staring back at me, Nicole and I on our first vacation, photos from our wedding, our first Christmas in this house. I sat down on the floor, staring at a picture of us, arms wrapped around each other in front of a snowy cabin, laughing like we were the happiest people in the world. For a moment, that familiar ache hit, thinking of what I'd thought we'd had, the version of us I'd once believed in. But the strange thing was, the feeling wasn't as sharp as I expected. It was like looking at strangers. The smiles in those photos felt like they belonged to a different time, a different life. There was no anger, no resentment left, just a quiet understanding that those memories had lost their power. They were part of a story that had come to its end. I packed up the photos and put the box in the corner. I wasn't sure if I'd ever look at them again, or if I'd eventually throw them out. Either way, they no longer defined who I was. They were just pieces of a past that didn't have a hold on me anymore. A few days later, I ran into Nicole's parents while I was out running errands. They were polite, but there was an unmistakable sadness in their eyes. We'd all been close, and I could see they were struggling, just as confused and hurt by her choices as I'd been. Her mom hugged me tightly, apologizing for everything, her eyes welling up with tears. Her dad shook my hand and looked at me with genuine regret. "We always thought of you as family, Kurt," he said, his voice low and steady. "We don't understand what she was thinking, but you deserve to be happy. Don't let this stop you from finding that." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. They had no obligation to say those words, yet there they were, standing by me even after everything. It was like getting permission to let go, to move forward, not out of bitterness, but out of acceptance. Their words stuck with me all the way home, echoing in my mind as I pulled into the driveway. That night, I sat down and made a list of everything I wanted to do, things I'd pushed aside, hobbies I'd let go of. I started writing things like learn guitar again, visit Europe, join a sports league, start cooking classes, just simple goals that would give me something to look forward to, something for myself. I felt something that had been missing for months, a spark of excitement, like there was finally a reason to look ahead. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something new, something real, and it was all for me. I was ready to start living a life that wasn't tied to the past, and for the first time in a long time, I actually felt free. The weeks passed in a way that felt strangely freeing, like I was finally waking up from a long, heavy sleep. Without Nicole in the house, it was quiet, but not in a way that felt lonely. The silence had a peace to it, like the walls were finally my own, free from the tension that used to linger in every room. I could breathe in a way I hadn't for years. Even the house itself seemed different. The light felt warmer, the air felt fresher, and every corner held a calm that I'd forgotten I could have. One Saturday morning, I found myself staring at that list I'd made, the one filled with all the things I'd promised I'd try once I was on my own. I decided to start small and signed up for a cooking class at a local community center. I'd always wanted to cook, but had never been much beyond basic meals. Nicole was the one who used to cook for us, and back then, it felt easier just to let her handle it. But now, I wanted to learn for myself, to make something that was all my own. Walking into that class felt strange at first. I was one of the few people there alone, and at first, it was a little awkward, watching couples and groups of friends laughing as they chopped and stirred. But I pushed through, and as the class got going, I found myself relaxing into it. There was something soothing about it, the rhythm of chopping, the focus it took to follow the recipe, the satisfaction of creating something from scratch. I didn't have to think about anything else, didn't have to worry about anyone's expectations. It was just me, a set of instructions, and a new skill I was learning for the first time. By the end of the night, I'd made my own pasta dish, complete with fresh sauce and perfectly cooked noodles. The instructor came by to taste it, gave me a nod, and said, "Not bad for a first-timer." I couldn't help but smile. I realized I'd been holding back so many little dreams, always waiting for the right time to pursue them. But now that right time was finally here, and I had no reason not to go for it. That night, I came home, set the table, and plated the pasta I'd brought back. I poured a glass of wine, lit a candle, and sat down to enjoy it. It was just me at the table, no Nicole, no one else to talk to, but it didn't feel sad or lonely, it felt satisfying. I'd made something just for myself, and I could actually enjoy the quiet without feeling that ache I used to. For the first time, I was starting to see that maybe I was okay on my own, that I could create my own happiness without waiting on someone else to do it. After that, I made a point to check more things off my list. I found a local softball league and joined up, something I hadn't done since college. My first game, I felt rusty, my reflexes slower than they used to be, but the thrill was still there. My teammates were laid back, and we laughed through every inning, even when we lost. That was the best part. Just letting myself be part of something lighthearted and fun. I wasn't trying to impress anyone or keep up appearances, I was just there for the experience, and that was enough. Around that time, I started picking up my guitar again, dusting off the case and feeling the familiar weight of it in my hands. I'd put it down years ago, thinking I didn't have the time, but now it felt like reconnecting with an old friend. My fingers stumbled over the chords at first, the calluses gone, but I kept at it, finding a rhythm with each session. Every night, I'd sit in the living room, just me and the guitar, playing through old songs I used to know by heart. I could feel the music working through me, like it was bringing parts of me back to life, parts one hadn't even realized I'd lost. Friends noticed the change, too. They'd stop by sometimes to watch a game, catch up, or just hang out for a few beers. I didn't feel the need to put on a brave face or pretend I was fine. I actually was fine. One evening, my best friend looked around the house and then back at me, a look of surprise on his face. "You seem lighter," he said. "Like you're finally back, you know?" And he was right. I was back, but I was also different. I felt like I'd been stripped down to my core, forced to confront all the things I'd let slide over the years. And somehow, I'd come out of it stronger, more sure of who I was and what I wanted. There was no more second-guessing, no more looking over my shoulder wondering what could have been. Nicole and I had been over long before she left. It had just taken me a while to realize it. One evening, as I was getting ready to head to the gym, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Nicole, a simple short note saying she hoped I was doing well and that she'd been thinking about reaching out. She didn't say why, didn't ask for anything specific, just left it open-ended, like she was testing the waters. I stared at the message for a long time, surprised at how little it affected me. Months ago, a text from her would have sent me reeling, thinking about what went wrong, wondering what I could have done differently. But now I saw it for what it was, just a thread from a life I'd already let go of. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say, and honestly, I didn't want to risk letting her back in, even in some small way. I was done with that chapter, finally ready to build something new. That night, I sat down with that list I'd made, crossing off the things I'd already done, and adding a few more. I realized I'd barely scratched the surface of everything I wanted to do. Travel, pick up new hobbies, try a woodworking class I'd seen nearby. For the first time in years, I felt that rare spark of excitement, something that had been missing for so long, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like. I wasn't just making plans, I was building a future that was truly mine. As I sat there with that list, I felt a calm wash over me, a sense of possibility that had nothing to do with anyone else. This was my time, my life, and I was finally free to live it on my own terms. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Leaving Nicole's message unanswered felt like a final decision I didn't need to revisit. With that last tie cut, my life settled into a rhythm that felt steady, peaceful, and most of all mine. I threw myself fully into my cooking classes, picking up new techniques and mastering a few dishes that became staples. The guitar practice was coming along too. I was rusty, but slowly, songs I hadn't played in years started to sound familiar again. Every day, I felt more connected to the house, like each choice, each change made it feel more like a home I had chosen for myself. One Saturday, I took a solo hiking trip to the mountains. I hadn't done something like that in years, but it felt right to just go, surrounded by nature with no expectations, no timeline. The climb was challenging, but reaching the top made every step worth it. Sitting on a rocky ledge with nothing but endless miles of forest below and the sky stretching above, I felt something settle within me. I could feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd made it through the hardest parts. I wasn't carrying the past anymore. The weight of anger, regret, and bitterness had lifted. I felt lighter, more present, like I'd finally made room for something new. When I got home, I looked at the list I'd made months back, now half filled with check marks, each one a small victory. I crossed off a few more and added a couple of new things. Go on a road trip, try rock climbing, learn to paint. They were small goals, but each one felt like a chance to keep exploring this life I was creating from scratch. And it wasn't about running from the past, it was about building a future I could stand firmly in. I wasn't waiting for anything, or anyone, to feel whole. For the first time, my life felt like it was unfolding naturally, on my own terms. I'd imagined a future with Nicole for so long that I hadn't realized how fulfilling it could be to start fresh, to shape something purely for myself. And as I looked at that list of possibilities, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, genuine excitement for the road ahead.